Well, greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm excited to be here and to have an opportunity to talk to you about genocide and the law surrounding genocide. I had something of a dilemma in how to teach this, and I gave it some considerable thought. I've decided to teach it by introducing you to a dilemma that I harbored for a very great many years about one of the cases, or a series of cases, that took place at the Yugoslav tribunal involving the prosecution of crimes committed in Srebrenica as genocide. And I spent many years misunderstanding the concept of genocide until reasonably recently, when I uh, came to a different understanding about the significance of cultural genocide and how it fits within genocide. And so I figured that it might be most useful to you to understand a little bit about the practicalities of proving genocide at Srebrenica, and some of my sort of legal hesitations about the way those awful, awful crimes fit within the law of genocide, and then to sort of explain the process of me figuring out what was at stake here and why it didn't quite make sense for so long, might be helpful in you understanding the law of genocide also. So let me make this a little clearer. There are several things I want to do over our time together today. I want to provide you with a critical overview of the crime of genocide. And by the crime of genocide, I really mean the law defining and governing genocide. I want to sort of help you develop an understanding about the structure of the crime, which is a little counterintuitive, the politics of the type of destruction envisaged by the crime, which you'll come to understand more about momentarily, and the schism between the popular conception of the term genocide and the legal term genocide. And we'll talk more about whether that schism is necessary or whether public perceptions should change. The third thing I'd like to do with you is to build an appreciation of the significance of cultural genocide and how it relates to the dominant interpretation of the crime. The dominant interpretation is the one that I'll articulate to you about Srebrenica, which was adopted extensively by the Yugoslav tribunal and then by the International Court of Justice in a case involving Serbia and Bosnia. I also want you to come away from this class with a recognition of other legal concepts in the Genocide Convention, in particular, different ways of participating in genocide and different obligations to prevent and punish the crime. These form a sort of a mosaic, I guess, of norms that can be helpful in your understanding of how this crime fits within international criminal law generally. It's also important to understand the history of genocide's criminalization and some of the controversies surrounding it. I'll introduce some of these controversies as we go through, and hopefully you'll come away with a very nuanced understanding that helps you identify relationships with other classes that we've had throughout the course. So voila, that's the overview. I thought, as I suggested, that I would start by showing you a definition of genocide. So I thought what I would do was start with something of a narration of a case involving this individual on the screen presently next to me, and that's
General Radislav Krstić,
a general within the army of Republika Srpska, and a case that involved him and an allegation of genocide on his part in Srebrenica. For those of you who don't know, there were several thousand men, boys executed in Srebrenica, and really a harrowing, awful massacre that took place there. It was one of the central offenses charged by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and a number of convictions were entered, including for genocide. And Krstić was one of the commanders that was held responsible for this. On the left is a photo of him at Srebrenica, and on the right is a photo of him in The Hague. I sat through moments of his trial as a young lawyer, and it had a significant impression on me that I can relay through some of the evidence that I also obtained from working within the tribunal. So I'm not going to go into the Srebrenica genocide in great detail and the atrocities that took place there. I do want to give you a very short overview how geographically Srebrenica was in a corridor that was crucial in the unification of Republika Srpska, which is to the north of this map, and Serbia to the east. And Srebrenica was a key valley which was essential for the unification of Serbia proper and Republika Srpska to create a greater Serbia, and therefore had a very important strategic value. And for this reason, there were UN peacekeepers around the positions in Srebrenica in 1995 when this massacre took place. I'll say more about that in just a moment. One of the stories I think that's really shocking and starts to you thinking about the moral implications of what took place was the UN really, how to put this in words, performed spectacularly badly as a peacekeeping force around Srebrenica, and there's a tremendous amount of hand-wringing that took place as a result. One of the stories I heard was that at a certain juncture, UN troops sent a communique to headquarters saying there are Serb army military tanks on the upper echelons of the mountains here just below the Srebrenica Valley, and we need airstrikes on their positions before 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Otherwise, there's going to be a massacre here. And the UN came back at 11 a.m. saying, you submitted your request on the wrong form. It's interesting and heartbreaking to talk to people from the region who say, yeah, we really hate the Serbs that are responsible for this, but we hate the Dutch peacekeepers more because they handed our men and boys over to their executioners. And in the Netherlands, there's been much public debate and inquiry into the role of Dutch peacekeepers who were there under a UN mandate. But this is some of the imagery that they were responsible for taking at the time. They were separating men and boys from women in Srebrenica, and these men and boys were being placed on buses in the town. The putative justification for separating the men and boys from the women was that the men and boys would be screened for allegations that they had been responsible for war crimes. And yet this is another picture taken by Dutch peacekeepers of Serb forces burning identification of the men and boys at the vicinity. And so there's a sense in which, well, if they're burning identification, it's suspicious to think that they will be sent off to be screened. It seems more likely that they're not coming back. These are satellite images taken in 1995 at the time in places that were sites for massacres. So individuals were bussed to these locations, they were held in fields and then massacred. This is another site, Sandici Meadow, again in July 1995. Satellite imagery experts indicate that this is a group of men. These are buses that brought them in. And I mean, the facts are so brutal that there would be people waiting in buses, in a queue of buses, watching individuals being shot with revolvers. And then it would be their turn to exit the bus and to be executed. The shooting continued for so long as it was possible, but often they had to take breaks because the revolvers got so hot that they couldn't continue to use them. And in total, around 6,000, between 6 and 8,000 men and boys were executed as a result of this process. Again, more satellite imagery identifying bodies and burial sites as a consequence of this. What's interesting was that there was a very significant reburial process. So the people responsible decided to move the bodies to different locations, and part of the role in proving responsibility for this set of massacres involved tracing the original locations of the massacres. So in Granievo Farm, in Kravica Warehouse, Kravica Warehouse, I regret knowing about what took place in Kravica Warehouse. And so tracing through, as you'll see through the blue arrows, soil and pollen samples, blindfold ligatures, bottle labels and glass, all of these different forms of evidence in order to build a linkage between the original sites of the massacres and where the bodies were ultimately found, all of which was geared at proving that individuals like Köstich were responsible for what took place. And so, on its face, without knowing terribly much about the crime of genocide, this seemed like it might fit the definition. All of the victims were Bosnian Muslim, and it seemed to form part of a desire to destroy that group, which was initially my very preliminary understanding of what genocide entailed. And there seemed to be evidence that this destruction was intentional. So this, for instance, is the famous Directive Number 7 from Radovan Karadzic, the head of the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of Republika Srpska. Well, let me go through the salient aspect of Directive Number 7, and then tell you a little story about Karadzic, which you may or may not know. So this is an order to the Drina Corps. The Drina Corps is commanded by Köstich during the relevant period, and so it's the army group that is responsible ultimately for the killings that took place. And so the order instructs, while in the direction of Srebrenica and Zepa, Onkev's complete physical separation of Srebrenica from Zepa, which Zepa is a town that's neighboring, should be carried out as soon as possible, preventing even communication between individuals in the two enclaves. By planned and well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica and Zepa. And so, on its face, it looks like this is very clearly a very, very serious massacre. It's almost certainly a crime against humanity. The question is it also a genocide? And there seems to be a very strong intention to destroy the group. But then the question becomes, is it genocide? And there are a couple of things that I want to talk to you about that at least inhibited my understanding initially, and I think have confused the mainstream view about genocide, both at the Yugoslav Tribunal and in the International Court of Justice. There are a couple of stumbling blocks, but I wanted to come back to this photo to share it with you. So the initial idea of genocide, or at least the idea that I came to the practice of international criminal justice with, which I think is now synonymous with what I call a colloquial understanding or a vernacular understanding of genocide, is very much informed by the Holocaust. And the idea of this colloquial understanding of genocide is that, oh, well, it's destroying an ethnic group or attempting to destroy an ethnic group, and so on racial or religious grounds. And so then the initial question was, well, are these people, was this really an intent to destroy an ethnic or religious group, and certainly it was ethnically based. They were all Bosnian, the victims were all Bosnian Muslim, and the perpetrators were not. There was a strong ethnic element to it, but although extremely serious as a massacre, the number, when I had a very preliminary understanding, the number of victims seemed radically dissimilar to the Holocaust. And so I thought, well, it's undoubtedly very, very serious and undoubtedly a crime against humanity, but does it rise to the level of genocide? And there was another aspect to it that I found confusing as the ICTY and other courts concluded that it was a genocide, and that is that this particular photo shows the men and boys being separated from the women, and the women were deported. They were put in buses and forcibly transferred out of the region, but they weren't killed. And so I was confused, and the appeals chamber in the Yugoslav tribunal said, well, that the women were expelled indicates a desire to destroy the group because it couldn't reconstruct itself. But in another breath, I was like, well, how does deportation lead to the destruction of a group? It seemed that the very fact that people were allowed to survive seems to suggest, or at least I thought suggested, was inconsistent with the idea of destroying the group. It was about destroying these particular men. So this was the confusion that I had and that I entertained for a very long time. And in a way, I want to use this lecture as a way, as a vehicle, as a mechanism for explaining genocide and showing how actually my colloquial understanding of the offense is too bound up in a preconception of the Holocaust and the Second World War, and that actually as we go to look at the terms of the Genocide Convention itself, it reveals something quite different. And in revealing this legal conception of genocide, I also want to suggest to you that courts have misconstrued and misunderstood it in similar sorts of ways, although not exactly the same sorts of ways, similar sorts of ways as I have. I'm hoping that at the end of this, you come to a point of clarity in ways that are similar to mine, but I'm open to differences of opinion that we can discuss at the end of the lecture. So, the first thing I wanted to do in discussing the definition of genocide with you is simply to go over the convention itself. Now, I sometimes feel like this might be a little bit dry, but to my mind, it's always really helpful to sort of orient your discussion and see it on paper within the conventions that you'll use as blueprints. And so I want to go through this with you carefully. So the first thing, as a point of information, the Genocide Convention is adopted in 1948 and then enters into force once it has a sufficient number of ratifications in January 1951. I'll talk to you later on about the history and the personality of Ralph Lemkin in particular, who really made this his personal cause for a number of years. But for now, I want to go through the definition itself, which is in Article 2. We'll also circle back later to Articles 1 and 3 and so on and so forth. But for now, let's focus on the definition in Article 2. So it reads in the chapeau, in the first aspect. The present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And then there's the enumerated acts one has to commit with this intention. The first is killing members of the group. And that killing members of the group is the overlap with, I think, Holocaust-type ideas of what genocide is made of, what constitutes genocide. The other elements are less so, and so it's important for us to dwell on the other elements and what they mean in some detail. So B is causing serious bodily harm, bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, there's an aspect of this that's very important to bring home to you. And that's again about the relationship between the chapeau and then the enumerated crimes. So, genocide is what makes genocide especially distinct is primarily the intention aspect. And what's crucial to prove a genocide is that one has an intention to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And then you go about one of the acts between A and E. Now, if you focus just on A momentarily, it says killing members of the group. And so in a technical legal sense, if you intend to destroy an entire racial group and you kill just 2 people, you've committed a genocide. And in that sense, genocide is structured in ways that is vaguely akin to attempt in the criminal law. An attempt is also a type of inchoate crime that is largely determined by intention. Your intention to rob a bank, and you have to do certain steps to begin robbing the bank, and that is sufficient for conviction of attempted robbery. And so it's important for you to understand that genocide is structured like this, because, my hesitation earlier is like, well, obviously what happened at Srebrenica was totally unspeakable, totally mind-blowingly awful. But my initial hesitation was, well, doesn't it have to be more larger or bigger or more extensive than that to constitute genocide? And the answer to that is no. When we look at the law also, it's very interesting to see that genocide, which is maybe then, technically then, it might be possible for a single individual to commit a genocide by himself. And this might be possible if someone decided out of ethnic hatred that they were going to kill all New Zealanders. And often you will never, as a matter of proof, you won't know that this particular individual had as a plan to kill all New Zealanders. And often a substantial number of killings of New Zealanders is the evidential basis one employs to extrapolate backwards and infer that, there was an intention to kill them all. But let's imagine a different evidential situation where you find in some crazed individual's diary writings that clearly establish an intention to kill all New Zealanders, and an individual goes about a program of killing 2 and then is apprehended. That constitutes technically, legally, a genocide. And so the second tension really is between a collective notion of criminal offending requisite for genocide. I think when we speak colloquially of genocides, we presuppose that this is a coordinated social process that's deeply evil, bent on destroying a group. And yet the legal conception of it is highly individualized. It's about holding individuals responsible for a crime like genocide and determining under what circumstances they as individuals commit the crime. So that is another of the important lessons to be learned from the definition of genocide. What that means is that there's sort of a schism between a public discourse about genocide and the legal meaning. And this plays out really quite keenly in Rwanda in particular, where there was unequivocally a genocide in a very Holocaust type conception of that, in a very Article 2A way, although other elements were also hugely important. But the colloquial notion of genocide, and I just used it, is that there was a genocide in Rwanda. But from a legal perspective, there were actually multiple acts of genocide. My former colloquial use aggregated them all together and sort of gestured at the social cohesion necessary to achieve what took place in Rwanda in 1994. But my legal understanding that I just shared based on Article 2 was just speaking to a whole range of different genocides of different sorts. It's very interesting literature trying to quantify the number of perpetrators of the Rwandan genocides, but the number is very, very high. And so in a technical legal sense, it's more accurate to say that there were thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of genocides in Rwanda. So you start to get this strange sense of mismatch between the ways that we think about genocide, and these are the ways that sort of animated my initial impressions of Srebrenica, and the way the law enacts the criminal offense called genocide. But there's one other aspect that I think is really quite key that has led to important misunderstandings in the law around genocide. And this was another of the points that sort of confused me about Srebrenica. Because if you look at B, C, D, and E, they're not actually about just killing people. And so for the longest time, I struggled with the relationship between, in the chapeau, the idea of intent to destroy, and then the enumerated crimes. For instance, E. If you're enforcibly transferring children of one group to another group, you're not killing anyone. You're just moving them. And so for the longest time, I thought, well, does this presuppose the idiotic genocidaire? Even under B, take B for instance, causing serious mental harm to members of the group. Well, that may make their lives considerably worse, and invariably does, but does it destroy them in the relevant sense? How do these things go together? Is this a conception of like a crime like attempt with an idiotic perpetrator? Idiotic because he or she assumed that he or she could destroy somebody physically by causing them mental harm. Well, you just can't. I mean, maybe by some attenuated process whereby the person no longer wants to live and becomes suicidal, perhaps, but that seems quite attenuated, and I didn't understand what the relationship was. To place this back in the Srebrenica context, I couldn't understand at all how a court could conclude that deportation of women was relevant to establishing genocide. It seemed like if they were being deported, that was evidence that the perpetrators weren't trying to destroy the group as such. So at this juncture, I hope you understand the dilemma, at least, in looking at this. And now I want to move and offer you something of a way out. Before I move to offer you this way out, or at least explain how we got to this position, the final piece that sort of locked in my confusion was the Yugoslav Tribunal and the International Court of Justice in Bosnia and Serbia. They all said that the destruction envisaged by the Genocide Convention is physical destruction. So we can't say, oh, well, it's cultural, and by separating people out, it really undermined our culture entirely. I mean, no one died in my hypothetical example, but as a group we were separated, and our particular worldview wasn't able to sustain itself. And in the face of those sorts of arguments, international courts of a criminal type and of a public international law type have unanimously and consistently found, no, that's not enough. It has to be physical destruction. It's an intention to physically destroy. But that just galvanized my confusion. Well, what about the deportations in Srebrenica? And what about E? Because, by definition, transferring children of one group to another group isn't causally potent to destroy them. So stay with me there. I don't want to confuse you too much, but I think it's an important moment in understanding the Genocide Convention. And it's only through thinking more recently and reading some excellent authors who've been writing about cultural genocide that I come to realize that the ICTY's position, the ICTJ's position, that intention destroy only relates to physical destruction, cannot, in my view, be coherent, and is not consistent with the negotiating history of the Genocide Convention that initially contained three different parts, which involved physical destruction, biological destruction, and cultural destruction. But because of politics I want to share with you, the three parts were abandoned, and what we have in A to E is sort of a rough and last-minute amalgamation of different elements from those three parts. And so killing members of the group is about physical destruction, whereas imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group is about biological destruction, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is about cultural destruction. And so let me tell you a little bit about that process. There was initially someone called Ralph Lemkin whose family had suffered tremendously during the Holocaust, and who made it his life's work over a long period to create a criminal offense called genocide. The term genocide was of his own making, and there are stories that when this finally passed in the General Assembly in 1948, somebody found him outside weeping on the steps of the United Nations buildings. And as part of this process, initial drafts, as I mentioned, had three different parts, and within each of these three different parts, there were 4 or 5 different ways of bringing about either physical, biological, or cultural destruction. But a number of governments, especially France and Canada, lobbied hard to have ideas of cultural genocide removed, and for obvious reasons. But the Canadian position was such that There was a communique sent to the Canadian representative to the tune, to the effect that should lobby as hard as you can to have the section on cultural genocide removed, and if necessary, vote against the entire resolution if it isn't. And so there was a strong push, for obvious political reasons, for countries to try and restrict the definition of genocide to physical destruction as a means of limiting the ways in which the colonial project had deliberately attempted to destroy indigenous cultural groups in a large number of countries. But the point is, if some states had as an intention to eliminate cultural genocide from the definition, they failed to do so because of the ways in which the criminal offense was ultimately defined in the convention itself. They failed to do it because ultimately in the convention there are acts which can't possibly, or don't seem obviously capable of bringing about physical destruction. And so the better view then is that the idea of intent to destroy involves physical, biological, or cultural destruction, depending on which iteration of the underlying acts one's focused on. I hope that's relatively clear. It is for me the only way that I can make sense of the structure of the criminal offense as defined, and I look forward to having further discussion with you about this. What I hope that you emerge from in all of this is some of the following. I want you to be able to explain how the definition of genocide is somewhat similar to an attempt in the criminal law. And again, to reiterate this arises because the intention is doing most of the work in blaming an individual for something as severe as genocide. True, there must be underlying predicate acts, but the true identity of genocide is predominantly held in the intention, and the number of acts required to commit a genocide is technically not numerous. Significant, don't you think? Already you start to get a sense that it's different from the way people use it, and quite different from the Holocaust during the Second World War. Question 2, what sort of destruction is requisite to constitute genocide? And so the answer to this, and I want to be clear here, is that courts have consistently held that it is physical destruction, but I'm not sure how that is reconcilable with the enumerated acts or the negotiating history to the Genocide Convention. The ICJ and ad hoc tribunals have said that it is physical destruction, and the politics that drive this interpretation are a politics which, contrary to crimes against humanity, is trying to restrain the meaning of genocide such that it doesn't encapsulate the sorts of practices that Western powers have been undertaking for several hundred years. And so in genocide, you get an immediate parallel of the same sorts of attempts to limit crimes against humanity, initially to armed conflict, as a means of warding off allegations that you too are responsible for these types of offenses. The original tripartite structure in the draft definition of genocide had elements of physical, biological, and cultural destruction. This codified definition reflects this history insofar as the 5 different enumerated elements are drawn from those different parts. In treaty negotiations, often they're compromised, and we looked at different language from the ICC statute that reflects these sort of like cumbersome compromises. And so the compromise in this instance says, oh, abandon the headings, and we'll take one, this, that, and the next thing, and put them together, and voila, there's the definition. But still, the remnants of the different categories live on, because some of the enumerated acts could not technically lead to physical destruction. And so this is the sort of the basis that I use. This is my little argument for why the interpretation, the limitation of genocide to simple physical destruction can't make sense. It can't make sense because it presumes an idiot genocidaire. And by I mean idiot, it might be an elegant term. What I mean is the genocidaire sets out to physically destroy a group by carrying out acts that cannot lead to that result. And that seems, oh, well, the person was so deluded that they were actually attempting something that couldn't reach the goal that they had set themselves. Well, I think that seems irrational and makes no sense. I think the better interpretation is to view the type of destruction envisaged as encompassing either physical, biological, or cultural destruction. And so in all of this, I'm hoping that what you observe is a sort of a divide, a schism between the legal meaning of genocide, which is highly individualized, which is more about attempt than the sort of a completion of a mass killing of a people, which is deferential to different forms of destruction, not just physical, how that really is overshadowed by our preconception of genocide that derives from the Holocaust. And in terms of, is this resolvable? I think it's resolvable by people withdrawing the projection on genocide as being uniquely about the awful genocide that took place during the Second World War, and people coming to understand the term in a more holistic sense that is consistent with its true legal meaning. So I come then to other salient aspects of the Genocide Convention, and I sort of gestured at these a moment ago. I'll show you again in the PDF document, in the convention itself, what I mean. And the first one is Article 1, which is just there. The contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. Wow! They have decided, these states, that they will prevent genocides and punish them. Well, how will you prevent genocides? And there's all sorts of different strategies that one might employ, but when it comes down to it, does this entail boots on the ground? And what then of the Rwandan genocide, where people like Romeo Dallaire are sending faxes every day to the Security Council saying, it's a genocide, it's a genocide. And various diplomats in Washington, D.C. are using the G word, because once they describe it as a genocide, there is an international obligation to prevent it. And that has obviously important ramifications. So I told you earlier about having friends, about the political debates you hear in a very abstract way in international discourse about whether, say, Sudan is a genocide or not. And then friends come back from Sudan and it's a genocide. Part of what's being played off here in the sort of the politics of labels is the obligation to prevent it. And the controversies around whether humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect is really morally necessary, given the tremendous failures of letting the Rwandan genocide pan out the way it did, first in 1994, and then the ways in which it was continued in the Congo thereafter, with even less attention, with again a repetition of the same indifference that allowed it to be carried out in 1994 without intervention. And so there's strong moral sense that really that's grotesque morally, and there's a lot of shame to be spread around as a consequence of that, especially when institutions like the United Nations Security Council has a legal duty to ensure peace and security globally. And so on the one hand, there's an argument which is sort of embodied in the idea of responsibility to protect, that we should be taking this obligation seriously in the Genocide Convention. It's a legal obligation. It's a moral obligation. We should be intervening far more often to prevent genocides like this, versus a more critical, instrumental idea about humanitarian intervention that's, in the end, it's a Trojan horse for imperialism and expansionism. You give powerful states with the capacity to militarily intervene in countries some pretext to do it in the name of humanitarianism or whatever other lofty ideal you want. They are going to take advantage of that, and what the net effect of all of this in the world is just more violence. And so there are interesting debates between those two positions. In some important senses, those debates reflect debates about the propriety and significance of international criminal justice as an intervention also. But notice also the reference to punishing genocide and the idea that states have a duty to punish. So when we discussed universal jurisdiction cases earlier in Belgium, Belgian authorities would say, yeah, sure, this is controversial, but we have a duty in the Genocide Convention to punish this. And if we find people responsible for genocide in our societies, this triggers a legal obligation on our part. And we're only doing what international law compels us to, that almost no one else is complying with. So it's an interesting relationship again between the formal requirements of genocide and the politics of enforcement that surround them. There are two more things that I want to stress. The first is the following acts shall be punishable: genocide by itself. A conspiracy to commit genocide is made punishable by the Genocide Convention, which is interesting because conspiracy by itself doesn't really attach to any modern international crimes anymore. Conspiracy is controversial because conspiracy is basically an agreement. And it's controversial because oftentimes agreements are not explicit, they're implicit. And so then the question becomes, well, at what juncture do we move into simple thought crimes? And how do you know what people agree and implicitly commit to? Conspiracy is controversial. It was used extensively in the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials in ways that many people think, especially in Tokyo, in ways that many people think was ludicrous. So the survival of conspiracy in the Genocide Convention is interesting. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide is very interesting idea. What constitutes incitement? And it creates sort of speech crimes, speech manifestations of genocide. One thinks immediately of Radio Television Mille Collines, which is broadcasting hit lists and intensely discriminatory racial hatred in Rwanda during the genocide as a sort of an obvious manifestation of this. But there are others also, and the idea of incitement is important to include. There is also a concept of attempt to commit genocide, which is also very interesting given that the offense is already defined in ways that very much mimic an attempt. So the inclusion of attempt is interesting. Complicity in genocide is also a very fascinating topic. I spent many moons working on complicity, and there are fascinating debates to be had that we can pick up on during the discussion about whether complicity in itself is the same thing as aiding and abetting, how this relates to other forms of responsibility like superior responsibility, whether complicity is an inchoate crime or whether it's a way of participating in genocide proper. All of these, I think, are interesting and important points. The final one that I've raised in different contexts in our discussions is the inclusion of this in pink, the anticipation in the Genocide Convention of an International Penal Tribunal. And of course, at that moment, there was none. But there's a sense throughout the convention and prior and before and after that at some point we'll have an international criminal tribunal. It seems obvious it's really just a matter of political expedience or that we don't. And so again, what an amazing moment in our lifetimes that one is created in 1998 and that we get to sort of learn about international criminal justice as a means of observing and criticizing its work. So those then are the final ideas. The last three about the context. I've mentioned really Ralph Lemkin as the chief architect of genocide as his personal project. 11 is important though. Well, let me stay with 10 momentarily. Is this controversial? Well, remember McRae's critique that, and others have made it in great detail also, that by creating a collective notion of ethnicity and race and things of this sort, you're sort of locking in and reifying concepts of ethnicity when in potentially that may not be the best idea and the concepts themselves may have been imposed. So even at the time, it was controversial whether international law should play a role in doubling down on the sorts of divides that had led to the violence. 11's a fascinating question too about whether genocide is the crime of crimes. It certainly became labeled that way in recent years. Previously, and this I guess foreshadows our next lecture on aggression, previously the Nuremberg tribunals and Tokyo Tribunal also were mostly concerned about aggression. The idea being, well, starting this war is the thing that led to so much untold suffering, and war crimes were just one aspect of the total suffering, and atrocities were one aspect of the total suffering that launching this aggressive war entailed. Really, it's the aggression that's the worst of worst. This matters in important sorts of ways because what happens in international criminal justice is you end up having to, for very practical reasons, you have to develop hierarchies of crimes for reasons like sentencing. Well, if someone's committed a genocide and a war crime, which gets the stronger sentence? And you have to have hierarchy in order to create incentives for defendants to cooperate. And it's very difficult to do that because in a large sense, a genocide already exceeds the boundaries of the punishment criminal law can inflict. So a good example of this is the former Prime Minister of Rwanda, Jean Kambanda, who, in a spirit of cooperation and goodwill, initially, well, that's his argument, initially pled guilty to genocide. And when the tribunal gave him life imprisonment nonetheless, he said, well, I recant my statement of guilt because, like, nothing came of all my cooperation and my statement of guilt. Why would anyone ever confess to any crimes in the future ever again if that's the case, if you're going to get life anyway? So it's complicated, and questions of hierarchy are significant. And so what's interesting to observe in the final breath is that while definitions of crimes against humanity have changed quite substantially between institutions over the years, and we saw that in practice in our last discussion, the definition of genocide has not changed so substantially. And there's been a willingness of institutions like the International Court of Justice to follow the Yugoslav Tribunal's case law. And really, it has had a strong precedential pull. So that's really interesting. And if one was to ask the why, it is an interesting relationship, but I believe that the political tensions around expansion of genocide are such that Western powers have been not at all interested in broadening it because it's so immediately threatening. So voila, there is a long, but I hope helpful introduction to the concept of genocide. To circle back to Srebrenica, I wanted to finish by playing you a video that I find striking, which again embodies the two parallel ideas about international criminal justice. This is a statement of guilt by one of the accused named Dragan Obrenović, who was in the Drina Corps, one of Krstić's subordinates. And the one view of this particular statement of guilt is that this is so contrite that the criminal law has no real business punishing an individual in addition to what he is experiencing, that criminal justice can in fact promote this type of catharsis and can be a theater for contrition and reconciliation, versus, oh, this is just some dude trying to save himself from a long sentence. He's mispronouncing words in Serbo-Croatian in order that the real audiences don't understand that this is not heartfelt. And you'd have to be pretty cynical, to paraphrase something a friend who worked on the case said. You'd have to be pretty naive, rather, to think that this was heartfelt. Within those poles is a metaphor about international criminal justice generally, and so I show it to you in that spirit.
Your Honours, I am grateful to you for granting me leave to address you today. On the territory of the country in which I was born, shooting from firearms was usual when celebrating the birth of a male child. These shots tell you everything: what a new male member of the family means and what is expected of him. Strength, protection. He should be a warrior, a soldier, the head of the family, as they say in our parts. Unfortunately, when other kinds of shooting started in the former Yugoslavia, shooting in war, it was normal for every man, every male child, to put on a uniform, take up a weapon, and go to protect his homeland, his nation, and ultimately his family. This was expected of him. This was his role. A sacred role. There was no choice. You could be either a soldier or a traitor. At the beginning of the war, it seemed as if the war and all it brought with it was impossible, that this wasn't really happening to us, and that everything would be resolved within a few days, and that finally our generation would have a chance. We didn't even notice how we were drawn into the vortex of interethnic hatred, and how neighbors were no longer able to live beside each other, how death moved into the vicinity, and we didn't even notice that we had got used to it. Death became our reality. Unfortunately, it became everyday reality. Who before that could have believed that the horrors of war could become everyday reality? Who could have believed that they could become a part of our lives? Surrounded with horrors, we got used to them and went on living like that. Among those horrors, things happened that were done by people who knew each other. People who until yesterday had lived almost as family members together. In Bosnia, a neighbor means more than a relative. In Bosnia, having coffee with your neighbor is a ritual. And this is what we trampled on and forgot. We lost ourselves in hatred and brutality. And in this vortex of terrible misfortune and horror, the horror of Srebrenica happened. I am here before your honors because I wish to express my remorse. I have thought for a long time, and I'm always followed by the same thought: guilt. I find it very hard to say this truth. I'm to blame for everything I did at that time. I am trying to erase all this and to be what I was not at that time. I'm also to blame for what I did not do, for not trying to protect those prisoners. Regardless of the temporary nature of my then post, I ask myself again and again, what could I have done that I didn't do? Thousands of innocent victims perished. Graves remain behind, refugees, general destruction and misfortune and misery. I bear part of the responsibility for this. There is misfortune on all sides that stays behind as a warning that this should never happen again. My testimony and admission of guilt will also remove blame from my nation because it is individual guilt, the guilt of a man named Dragan Obrenović. I stand by this. I am responsible for this. The guilt for which I feel remorse and for which I apologize to the victims and to their shadows. I will be happy if this contributes to reconciliation in Bosnia, if neighbors can again shake hands, if our children can again play games together, and if they have the right to a chance. I will be happy if my testimony helps the families of victims, if I can spare them having to testify again and thus relive the horrors and the pain during their testimony. It is my wish that my testimony should help prevent this ever happening again, not just in Bosnia, but anywhere in the world. It is too late for me now, but for the children living in Bosnia now, it's not too late. And I hope that this will be a good warning to them. In our wartime sufferings, no one has come out as the victim. Everybody is suffering now. On all sides, there is still pain. What has won is victory. What has won the victory is misfortune and unhappiness as a consequence of blind hatred. The spirit of this unhappiness still hovers over our Bosnian hills, which have suffered so much, and it will take years to wipe out the traces of this horrible war. And to have smoke rise again from people's chimneys, from the hearths, and maybe decades will have to pass before the wounds in people's souls are healed. If my confession, my testimony, and my remorse, if my attempt to face myself contributes to the quicker healing of these wounds, I will have done my duty of a soldier, a fighter, a human being, and a father. In the end, I wish to thank the prosecution for their efforts to establish the truth and for their efforts to have justice done. I would like to thank you, Your Honors, for listening to me so attentively throughout my testimony. I try to answer every question put to me as correctly and truthfully as I could. Thank you.
So that's the end of this particular lecture. I look forward to speaking to you about it more now.